Excellent. Because if I have it, then I won't need it.
Okay, welcome everybody. We'll get started. If you want to... Did I miss something? Is it loud enough? Well, turn that puppy down. So welcome to Cantini. My name's Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the museum, and we have a twofold purpose for welcoming you here. One is we hope that you have seen or will see our special exhibit on the propaganda of World War I. And we also have a speaker tonight. Before I introduce her, just a quick reminder, if you haven't been here before, Cantini is the historic estate of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, longtime owner, editor, and publisher of the Chicago Tribune, who lived here, and his home is a wonderful museum about 500 yards that way, where you can learn more about him and his distinguished career as a journalist and philanthropist and civic leader. But second only to the Chicago Tribune in the Colonel's heart was the 1st Division of the United States Army, in which he served as a citizen soldier in World War I. And he came home from the war and named this place Cantini in honor of the tiny little village 75 miles north of Paris, France, where America fought its first battle of World War I, and therefore its first battle for Europe. And we still have troops in Europe and security concerns in Europe. Like so many World War I veterans, he was profoundly affected by the war. He was dedicated to its veterans for the rest of his life, often welcomed them in huge rallies here on the estate. And when he passed away in 1955, he left all of his considerable wealth, $55 million, to establish what is now the Robert R. McCormick Foundation of Chicago, our parent organization, which does approximately $50 million worth of good in the Chicagoland area and the United States annually. And he said, turn my estate in Wheaton, Illinois into a public park for the people of Illinois. If you joined us from Wisconsin, as our speaker did tonight, or Iowa or Indiana, you're just as much welcome as those of us from Illinois. So that's why there's a 1st Division Museum on a park called Cantini, which was once the estate of Colonel Robert R. McCormick. And his picture's right behind this screen, so you can get more detail over there. So it's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. We conceived of this exhibit on wartime propaganda because 2014 is the first year of the centennial of World War I, not the American entry, but its outbreak in Europe. And we thought a World War I theme would be appropriate. And then we wanted to have something to kick off, introduce the exhibit and kick it off and introduce it to all of you, and we found the perfect person in Dr. Susan A. Brewer. And fortunately, we didn't have to fly her in from across the country. She was very nearby at the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point, where she is a professor of history. She is the author of this book, the perfect book for tonight's event, Why America Fights, Patriotism and War Propaganda from the Philippines to Iraq. And that, I think, includes World War I. So she'll talk about World War I propaganda and the broader ideas of propaganda. She is a graduate of Cornell University. She did her work at the London School of Economics. She is the author of a previous book, To Win the Peace, British Propaganda in the United States during World War II. And she is joined by her husband, Bob, way in the back. Raise your hand, Bob, who is also a professor of art at the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. And so we're glad to have both of you here, and it is my great privilege to introduce to you Susan A. Brewer.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about World War I propaganda and show you lots of images, and then I hope to answer any questions that you might have or take a stab at answering those questions. So here was the problem. How do you persuade an entire nation that it is time to go to war? The solution was war propaganda. American World War I propaganda made the vivid and compelling case that America's global mission was to save civilization and spread democracy, even if that meant sacrificing some of its democratic traditions to do so. The legacy haunts us to this day. In April 1917, after almost 3 years of neutrality, the United States took sides and entered World War I. President Woodrow Wilson wanted to raise an army of 3 million men and ship them to Europe as soon as possible. He knew this effort required the total mobilization of America's resources, including its people. He set up the Committee on Public Information, or the CPI, to blanket the nation with patriotic instruction. The CPI would turn out to be an innovative and controversial government propaganda agency. Propaganda is the deliberate manipulation of facts, lies, and ideas. The term did not yet have the negative meaning it would acquire after World War I, but Americans still preferred to call their propaganda information. Wilson charged journalist George Creel with directing the CPI, and Creel was a progressive reformer who, with experience campaigning for child labor laws, cleaning up government, ending corporate corruption, he believed in bringing this crusading reform spirit to promoting the war. He called the CPI a vast enterprise in salesmanship, the world's greatest adventure in advertising. When war broke out in Europe in August 1914 between the Allies led by Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central Powers led by Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the United States had adopted neutrality. American companies traded with both sides, and U.S. banks loaned hundreds of millions of dollars, with more in the end going to the British and the French than to the Germans. Both the British and German navies violated America's freedom of the seas, but the German use of submarines to attack and sink ships provoked much greater outrage, as illustrated by this poster, which referenced the sinking of the British liner, the Lusitania, off the coast of Ireland by a German submarine in 1915. 1,000 people drowned, including 128 Americans. When President Wilson's efforts to mediate a peace failed and Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, the president asked Congress to declare war against the Central Powers and join the side of the Allies. President Wilson thought that the U.S. intervention would bring the war to an end and make possible a U.S.-led New World Order based on democracy and capitalism. Wilson believed that such a New World Order would be best for the United States and best for the world. He declared that the United States must make the world safe for democracy. To rally popular support for World War I, Creel and the CPI faced enormous challenges. Today, the president speaks to the nation on television. Back then, there was no single way to reach the American people all at once. Another significant challenge was the diversity of American opinion regarding the war. Although many Americans celebrated their historical and cultural ties to Britain and France, many others felt no such connection. America in 1917 was a nation of millions of immigrants with family ties to the nations at war. German Americans, one of the largest ethnic groups in the country, may not have been sympathetic to the German monarchy of Kaiser Wilhelm, but felt some reluctance to go to war if it meant killing their cousins. Some Americans objected to their new allies. Irish Americans, for example, had no desire to fight on the side of the British, who had recently crushed another independence movement in Ireland. Jewish Americans, many of whom had fled Russian pogroms, did not want to join the side of Russia, even if the Tsar had been removed from power. And Scandinavian Americans tended to support neutrality. Socialists and radical labor unions opposed the war. They argued that rich men profited while working class men fought and died in the trenches. Pacifists opposed the war out of religious and ethical convictions. Some progressive reformers worried that the war would distract Americans from solving problems at home. Others questioned how the United States was going to make the world safe for democracy if it was teamed up with the British Empire, which ruled 1/4 of the globe. Weren't Americans against empire and for self-determination, they wondered? So to win over such divided opinion, the CPI and its staff of artists, journalists, academics, and advertising professionals knew it had to come up with a powerful case. Initially, they wanted to adopt an educational approach, but education takes time. So they relied on much more dramatic and simplistic messages. The CPI combined practical instruction to enlist, produce, conserve, and buy liberty loans with emotional appeals to love, guilt, pride, anger, hate, generosity, shame, and fear. Some people respond to guilt, some to generosity. The CPI wants something for everyone. So, propaganda relied on patriotic symbols. Uncle Sam and his female counterpart, the goddess Columbia, who was really popular in the 19th century. She is about to fade out of popularity, but you'll see her in World War I posters. She's going to be replaced by Lady Liberty. So Uncle Sam will still have a female partner, but it will be Lady Liberty. You'll see the eagle used a lot, the flag, images of the troops, historical figures. The colors are eye-catching. You'll notice a lot of red, white, and blue. So these are all symbols that resonate with American audiences. Propaganda also drew on cultural beliefs of the day to represent Americans and their enemies. So these include religious values. So you'll frequently see the United States identified as a Christian nation, or you'll see Christian symbols used in the propaganda. You'll also see racial views. Americans are almost always presented as white. You'll also see many appeals to beliefs about gender. So you'll see American men shown as noble, as strong, and as protectors of the weak. There are more mixed messages for women. So women, especially of allied nations, France and Britain, are shown to be in need of rescue, as in this poster. American women are shown as vulnerable, they're shown as sexy, and they're shown as capable of taking on new responsibilities. So propaganda draws on all these beliefs and symbols to present the war as a struggle between good and evil. And Americans are the protectors of Western civilization. The Germans are shown as dehumanized barbarians, often called Huns, after the Mongol invaders of the 5th century. So in this poster, Hun or Home, a choice appears to be offered, but in the tradition of effective propaganda, the right answer is made clear. So the CPI wanted all Americans to hear and see the same messages over and over. So they set up an extensive bureaucracy with this goal in mind. And what makes this bureaucracy in part so effective is that it was able to recruit a number of volunteers from across the country to assist in delivering these messages. So the CPI is definitely a government agency, but the propaganda is delivered in a sort of public-private collaboration. Okay. So the CPI set up a division of news, which delivered official reports to the news media 24 hours a day, and very often the government's written report of the news would appear in the newspapers word for word about what was happening. The CPI recruited novelists to write patriotic stories for magazines. University professors wrote 90 pamphlets explaining the war for children in 100,000 school districts across the country. The CPI's division of speakers selected 300 speakers to travel the country and speak before civic organizations, clubs, and church groups about the war. The CPI created a division of women's work to mobilize 1/2 of the population. The division of work with the foreign-born targeted immigrant groups with programs in a multitude of languages, all pushing Americanization and support for the war. Although the CPI was located close to the White House in Washington, D.C., the CPI's division of advertising was at home on Madison Avenue in New York City. So the CPI's division of advertising wrote ads to appear in newspapers and magazines, like this one called The Hohenzollern Dream, which is about Germany's militarism and the need to crush this war-making state. Now, there was some belief that it was not acceptable for the government to buy ad space directly in magazines and newspapers. So the Division of Advertising adopted what was called the Chicago Plan. I'm not sure why Chicago, but the Chicago Plan, which would be a system in which private individuals would buy the ad space and then donate it to the government, and then the government would put these ads in newspapers and magazines. And in the end, about $5 million worth of ad space was donated for the appearance of these ads. The CPI also knew that a lot of people did not read the newspaper from cover to cover, but they definitely looked at the cartoons. And so they had a bureau of cartoons to organize what they called the cartoon power of the nation. And so every week, the Bureau of Cartoons would send out a bulletin to cartoonists around the country with suggestions of what messages they should include in their cartoons that week. So the messages might include buy Liberty loans, that more nurses were needed, to stop Sunday motoring, all kinds of messages that could be delivered through the cartoons were suggested here. And as you notice, this is James Montgomery Flagg, who's the famous artist of Uncle Sam's I Want You, makes this wonderfully ambiguous quotation: the cartoonist makes people see things, which we know can have two different meanings, right? The CPI also had a division of films. Going to the movies was a really popular leisure activity during the 19-teens. And the CPI used films in a number of ways. First of all, it collected film footage from the battlefields done by the Signal Corps and would edit that into these official war films that would be shown as newsreels during a movie program at your local theater. The CPI also made their own films. This is a poster advertising its first official war picture called Pershing's Crusaders, after General John Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force. You'll notice how the title Pershing's Crusaders links the American fighters with medieval Christian knight crusaders. You know, calling on that great American tradition back when the Americans participated in the Crusades. The CPI also made short instructional films. One was called If Your Soldiers Hit, which was about what kind of medical treatment troops received. Another was called The Bath of Bullets, which was about the production and use of the machine gun. So these short instructional films would also be shown during feature movie programs as well. Along with the films, the CPI also organized a unit called the 4-Minute Men. These were 75,000 volunteers, young men, usually sort of rising young men in their community. They would be vetted by their respected elders. And these young men would be allowed to speak in the movie theater during the 4 minutes it took to change the reel for the next reel of the picture. And they would receive from Washington, from the CPI, instructions about what to say in their speeches. And so their speeches would be about the nature of the enemy, why America's fighting in the war, the need to buy more Liberty loans, the need to conserve. Very often, these local young men would reference local men in uniform in their speeches. So it's a really remarkable way of getting a national message delivered by local people to a local audience. There was also a college 4-Minute Men, a woman's 4-Minute Men. I guess women spoke at matinees when women went to the movies. There's a junior 4-Minute Men for school children to do these speeches. And 4-Minute Men ended up not just speaking at the movies, but they spoke at union halls, lumber camps, grange halls. I mean, they spoke everywhere. So they were a really effective way of reinforcing the message that the CPI was showing in the film with a live speaker then delivering a similar message in person. Okay. Because we're so interested in the posters, I wanted to say a lot about the division of pictorial publicity that was responsible for coming up with the 2,500 designs of posters that the CPI produced and reprinted into 20 million posters, more than all the other nations at war combined. So the Americans really, even though they were in the war such a short time, really outproduced everyone in terms of posters. The head of the Division of Pictorial Publicity was Charles Dana Gibson, one of the most famous illustrators in America, really well known for his Gibson Girl. And he attracted the other most highly paid, most admired illustrators of the era to volunteer their work for government propaganda. So the posters were placed everywhere. They were at any place the public might be present. So at train stations, bus stations, factories, office buildings, schools, post offices, on the city street, they were everywhere. So it would be impossible to miss them. And they delivered all the messages that the CPI wanted communicated to the public. So let's look at some of those. So enlistment, recruitment, getting young men to serve was a key goal of wartime propaganda. And this poster by Charles Dana Gibson tells a whole story about the reluctant mother turning over her boy to a grateful and understanding Uncle Sam. I wanted you to see there are two different ways to illustrate the same slogan. So we see that the U.S. Army is going for the more authoritative version of I Want You, and the Navy is going for the more seductive version of I Want You. And I certainly think they know their audiences, right? This is a 19-teens version of Be All You Can Be, about how if you go into the Army, you will learn skills, you will develop a great moral character as illustrated by the crusading knight, and you will also get a very fine physique, and maybe see the world. All true. African Americans were drafted and encouraged to enlist in World War I. They served in segregated units under white officers. So the U.S. military, the U.S. Army was a Jim Crow army, and the posters reflect that. You will not see signs of racial integration in America. There are specific posters designed to recruit African Americans. And in this one, you see it comes with Abraham Lincoln's blessing. So there was certainly recognition that among African Americans that there was hypocrisy present if they were being recruited and sent to fight to make the world safe for democracy when they themselves, many of them, did not have the right to vote back home. But they did serve, they served with distinction, but in the victory parade in Paris, they were not allowed to march. Okay, now we come to one of the more controversial aspects of World War I propaganda, and that is its use of atrocity propaganda. In part, this message was influenced by the British, who widely disseminated an official report on the German atrocities committed following the German invasion of Belgium in 1914. Now, there were many actual atrocities. The German invasion led to thousands of civilian deaths and the destruction of villages and towns. What captured the public's attention, however, was the sensational part of the report based on unverified eyewitness and hearsay testimony, which included a few accounts of the rape of women and the murder and mutilation of children. The British and later the Americans charged the Germans with carrying out a systematic campaign of mass rape and mutilation of children. And what you'll see in World War I propaganda is that posters, movies, stories, ads repeatedly show the Germans as monsters. Propaganda also models the appropriate response to this action. The newspaper headline says, "Huns kill women and children." Okay, these two posters also show us which choice is the patriotic choice to make in wartime for young men. There are lots of posters directed at workers and extolling wartime production, and very often, like this one, they will link the workers in the factories at home to the troops on the front lines, as though they are partners in the same venture. And there are also posters to remind workers that what they make must not be defective. The CPI did many posters for the Food Administration on conservation practices during the war. Some of these are just gorgeous illustrations, very eye-catching. Kaiser brand is unsweetened, for those of you who can't read that in the back. The CPI also made posters for the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the YMCA. I'm sure this one inspired a lot of graffiti, I think, I would imagine. But I do want to say that by October 1918, American women had turned 2.5 million pounds of wool into socks and sweaters for the troops. There are a number of posters targeting women and calling them to service, some in traditional ways like knitting socks, and others in non-traditional ways, calling on women to put on their trousers and pick up the tools and do the jobs of men. There are many posters dedicated to raising money to pay for the war. So the US government would spend about $30 billion on fighting World War I, and 2/3 of that cost would be paid by loans from the American people. Through Liberty loans and also through war stamps and thrift stamps, and these were gauged at levels anybody could afford. So the smallest amount would be thrift stamps, which were 25 cents. So you could loan the government 25 cents by buying a thrift stamp. War savings stamps were at $5, and Liberty loans were valued from $50 to $100,000. 1 out of 3 US citizens bought at least one Liberty loan. And when you bought a loan, you received a badge that you could wear, and that would help put peer pressure on everybody else who had not bought a Liberty loan. So there are many appeals to buy loans, targeting all kinds of audiences, including children. So the Boy Scouts were quite active in aiding the war effort in a number of ways. And here are 2 children dressed in red, white, and blue, asking you to help their daddy by buying Liberty loans. The troops look pretty threatening, demanding. And this is a sort of happier version. And atrocity propaganda was used extensively to sell liberty loans. Well, this is a really intriguing, futuristic image of a kind of air and sea attack on New York City, showing the head of the Statue of Liberty lying in the harbor. Also quoting Abraham Lincoln. Posters targeted immigrants. Statue of Liberty is intact for this one. And this one for the Victory Liberty Loan shows the unity of the United States by listing names of many different ethnic groups as participating in supporting the war. The movies also encouraged people to buy Liberty loans. This is a Liberty loan picture by the Goldwyn Company showing a German attacking a Belgian girl who appears, if you see this, appears to have a cross coming out of her head. Yeah. Mary Pickford, who is the most popular actress at the time, made a Liberty Loan short called 100% American, which shows her desperately trying not to spend money on pretty clothes and ice cream sodas so she can save it up to buy a Liberty loan and celebrate. She gets to celebrate her success at the end by throwing a softball at the Kaiser and knocking him into a bowl of soup. So. Outside the theater, the most famous actors of the day, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and here Charlie Chaplin, spoke at bond rallies. So people could go to the movies, see their favorite actors doing Liberty Loan pictures, and then come out of the movie and see them speaking in person, calling on Americans to buy Liberty loans. So Mary Pickford's movie was called 100% American, and this is a poster echoing that message. Are you 100% American? Are you loyal? Are you patriotic? Have you bought a Liberty loan? So you see that the propaganda could turn into a lot of pressure to conform and support the war. And that message, along with the dehumanization of Germans in propaganda, caused a lot of unintended consequences as a result of this flood of war propaganda messages. So a number of patriotic Americans decided that if Germany and Germans were so evil, that they must eradicate all things German from American society. So sauerkraut becomes called Liberty cabbage. And German shepherds are called police dogs. And then it gets more serious. In Nebraska, people burned books in the German language. Patriotic organizations called for symphony orchestras to ban the playing of German music. Groups called upon schools to stop teaching the German language. Americans of German heritage were harassed. threatened, pressured to prove their loyalty. Some German Americans changed their names. Some stopped speaking German at home. About 250,000 Americans formed the American Protective League. These were volunteers who worked with the support of the Justice Department. These people spied on their neighbors, they opened mail, they bugged telephones, and they advocated assault on dissenters. While that was going on, Congress voted to restrict civil liberties with a number of acts. Some of them were, one was called Threats Against the President Act, the Sedition Act, the Espionage Act. So it was now possible to be arrested, tried, fined, and jailed for spoken threats against the president, for discouraging men from registering for the draft or enlisting, and for making any criticism of the conduct of the war and the war aims. So as a result, a man in Montana was sentenced to 20 years hard labor for refusing to kiss the flag. A farmer in Wisconsin was sentenced to a year in prison for saying that this was a rich man's war. The socialist leader Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for making a speech against the war in Ohio. So on the home front, this flood of patriotic messages combined with the suppression of free speech and a free press, and that meant that there was a limited, open and honest debate about what at the time was a tremendous break with tradition, and that was that the United States was sending millions of Americans to intervene in a world war in Europe. In addition, the news coverage of the war was heavily censored. So when the Americans arrived and started to make a difference and more were coming, it was clear to Germany that their time was limited, especially after a July offensive that the 1st and 2nd Divisions took part in with the Allies. The German chancellor responded to the news saying, quote, "Even the most optimistic among us understood that all was lost." But while this was happening in France and Belgium, the folks at home were seeing a cleaned up version of the war. News and photos were censored that would have a negative effect on the home front, the troops, or the Allies. So, for example, photos of enemy dead were allowed to be published, but not photos of American dead. And I think it's important for Americans to remember that their experience in World War I was not the same as their allies and enemies. The Americans took part in combat only in the last several months of the war. U.S. troops did suffer through the trenches, and they did experience chemical warfare, but they did not have to endure the years of stalemate on the Western Front and the casualty lists that ran into millions. Nevertheless, there was certainly a big celebration when the armistice was declared on November 11, 1918. So let's consider the legacies of American World War I propaganda. There was certainly great success at arousing patriotism. The nation was turned from neutrality to total mobilization. The CPI showed the power of combining practical instruction with emotional appeals. It also displayed a remarkable ability to reach diverse audiences spread over a large space before the era of TV or widespread use of radio. Americans displayed an astounding can-do spirit of voluntary cooperation, from knitting socks to practicing conservation to producing war material to enlisting. And they did it as part of this compelling story of good versus evil. The United States was seen as the home of democracy, justice, and freedom, and Germany the land of barbarism and militarism. And that leaves us with a number of controversies. The propaganda portrayed the troops as cheerful, singing, noble young men. This ad by the CPI promises that your boy will return home a victorious crusader. And it goes into this in detail. It talks about all these wonderful characteristics. He's going to be prompt and clean and neat and clean and, square-jawed and, kind to his little brother and all of this, that he is a fine young man. And certainly some soldiers did return in fine shape, but many suffered from exposure to poison gas and from what was called shell shock, or what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, to a civilian population which had been told that war turns boys into the best of men. There was also a lot of disillusionment about this idea of making the world safe for democracy. So at home, Americans were left feeling deeply concerned about the effects of war on democratic principles. They're concerned about the restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. They're concerned about the degree of suspicion, hate, and even violence directed at German Americans who had shown no evidence of disloyalty. War propaganda did not succeed in persuading everyone. If it had been, there would have been no need for those coercive measures, but the crackdown on dissent disturbed those who believed that the right to disagree and speak your mind was essential to the American system. As one prominent politician asked, quote, "When did it become un-American to criticize the president?" Unquote. Most Americans believe that criticizing the president is a time-honored American tradition. Did going to war mean that they must give up that freedom? Americans also turned their back on President Wilson's internationalism. The CPI's messages had focused on stirring up anger and hate against Germany, but had not cultivated public support for post-war international commitments. At the peace negotiations, President Wilson persuaded the Allies to support the creation of a new international organization called the League of Nations, which he hoped would serve to solve disputes and keep the peace. But he had failed to build a consensus of support back home for the League. Americans did not approve of the harsh penalties heaped on Germany by Britain and France, nor did they feel that they had fought to make possible the expansion of the British and French empires into Africa and the Middle East. When President Wilson returned home with the peace treaty, the U.S. Senate failed to ratify it, and the United States did not join the League of Nations. Another legacy is the profound distrust of government propaganda. In the 1920s and 1930s, it was pretty common to blame the British and the U.S. governments for misleading the American people about the war. It was reported that a lot of the atrocity propaganda had been false or grossly exaggerated. So following World War I, the term propaganda acquired a negative meaning of manipulation based on lies. And it also became associated with the Bolsheviks following the Russian Revolution. So Edward Bernays, who was on the CPI staff, saw that propaganda had become a bad word, but he loved what propaganda could achieve. So he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a new name. I'm going to call it public relations. And so he launched a new industry that's all about branding and creating an image, which he saw as propaganda, but he gave it a PR makeover, didn't he, by calling it public relations. So there's a whole new breed of Americans who feel that if they could sell war, they could sell almost anything. The CPI did have one fan of dubious distinction. Over in Germany, Adolf Hitler praised Allied propaganda for what he called its brilliant appeal to the primitive sentiments of the masses. So propaganda began to be seen as a tool of dictators, not of democracies. By the late 1930s, polls showed that Americans distrusted official propaganda. As the Second World War broke out in Europe, 80% of Americans told pollsters they did not want Nazi Germany to win, but they did not want to get involved in another war in Europe. So when the United States did enter World War II following the attack on Pearl Harbor, another president and another administration needed to achieve total mobilization for a longer and tougher war. So the people in charge of propaganda in World War II had to deal with the legacy of the CPI in World War I. And they had to regain the trust of American citizens in government instruction. You can't achieve total mobilization if you can't tell people what they need to be doing. So in World War II, the new propaganda agency called the Office of War Information adopted what they called a strategy of truth. They would avoid atrocity propaganda. They would rely less on arousing hate and fear and rely more on straightforward instruction, as described here by George Creel's successor, Elmer Davis, another journalist. You would tell the truth as much as you could. Of course, with enemies like Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, there was no need for misleading exaggeration. Elmer Davis said, "The truth is on our side." Another lesson for World War II propagandists is that you can't wait until the war is over to start promoting internationalism. That when President Roosevelt said he wanted the United States to win the war and win the peace this time, he wanted Americans to be ready to support international commitments when the war was over. And so the Office of War Information made a very large effort to encourage Americans to support international commitments and avoid a return to the kind of isolationist mentality that followed World War I. So, Uncle Sam came back in World War II. He was reissued. But World War I propaganda itself left us a very mixed legacy. Patriotic propaganda had made war look exciting, romantic, and humanitarian, but it had misled civilians about the realities of war and its costs. World War I propaganda revealed a dilemma. It showed that it could achieve short-term success by arousing strong public responses and mobilizing a nation for war, but it done so in a way that inspired long-lasting distrust and disillusionment. What no one doubted after World War I was that propaganda was a powerful weapon in time of war. How to use that weapon was the question. Thank you very much.
questions. And JD has got microphones, so please wait for a microphone to come to you.
When was the CPI started?
It was started a week after the U.S. entered the war, so in April 1917.
I'm really curious about this Uncle Sam image. When did it sounded like at the beginning you were saying that it was something that came back in World War I. When did we first start using the Uncle Sam image?
Uncle Sam? There is some fogginess about that, but Uncle Sam seems to first appear during the War of 1812. And some accounts say that Uncle Sam is named after an actual supplier of the U.S. Army whose name was Sam. Others say it comes from that U.S. that's stamped on everything. So that is there's competing claims, but Uncle Sam becomes a symbol of the United States throughout the 1800s.
Do you know what the budget was for the department, the CPI?
No, I don't. I'm sure it's written down someplace. George Creel is very proud of everything he accomplished, so he wrote a book after the war called How We Advertised America. If he had the figures, he probably wrote it down there. But the point, too, is that a lot of the people who worked volunteered. Hollywood volunteered, Charlie Chaplin volunteered. James Montgomery Flagg stalked out of a meeting when it was suggested that the artists should be paid for what they were doing. So I think the cost would be, in some ways, hard to measure. The 75,000 for Minutemen were volunteers. So there's the budget, and then there's the whole show.
The other part was you had, on the posters, it has different series of bonds. I think I saw 4.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so the Liberty loans were different drives or different campaigns. The first, second, third, and fourth, and then the Victory Liberty Loan Drive took place after the war was over.
One here, and one back there, and we've got a couple up here.
Okay. Was the use of mustard gas ever used in the propaganda?
Not in the posters. There were certainly news accounts of the mustard gas. I think it's because both sides are using it, and it was what was censored would be anything negative about the Allies, too. So because the British and French are using it, it really cannot be a subject for propaganda.
Did the people who made Liberty loans get paid back?
Yes, they did get paid back with interest. These are bonds, so they got 3 to 4% interest.
Okay, there's a question back there, and Sharon, there's a woman here. Okay, go ahead, sir.
Ma'am, can you name the players, a complete set of players on both sides of the war, and how many months was the United States troops in Europe?
Okay, I don't think I can name the complete set of players. There's a wonderful map in the exhibit, so I would just check that out because all of Europe was involved in the war. So I just named the leading nations on both sides. You know, Bulgaria was on the Central Power side, the Ottoman Empire was on the Central Power side. But I would check out that great resource. And the U.S. Declared war in April 1917, but it took several months for American troops to arrive in Europe and be still training and then be put into combat. So there are Americans who enlist earlier. Some go fight with Canadians, some fight with the British, some fight with the French. But officially, American troops really begin to see major combat in the spring of 1918. So they really start to make a difference in that summer of 1918, and then the armistice is declared in November of that year.
Regarding censorship, so much was volunteer. They pretty much wanted people to volunteer, like to we never used rationing. It was, you conserved because it was patriotic. On the idea of censorship, was it government censorship, or was it the media themselves were kind of taking it upon themselves to censor what was actually being printed?
Both. A lot of the military censorship was done by the military, and that was very heavy and strict censorship. Back home, what the U.S. government did was ask the media to cooperate with a kind of self-censorship. When, say, a reporter might violate the censorship, he would lose his accreditation. Or he might be covered by, his newspaper might take out like a $10,000 bond on him, and if he violated censorship, the newspaper would lose that $10,000. So it was very strict penalties.
I have a question about the illustrators. Were the illustrators, were they staff or were they contracted? Were they given a lot of freedom in the drawings? All these drawings are very magnificent in a lot of different styles. Were they? How did that process work?
Well, they would meet on a regular, there was a lot of dinners from what I can see. These are volunteers, right? And they're quite successful people. They meet regularly and they discuss the kinds of themes that they want to communicate in the posters. And I think what's interesting about this is that each artist brings his own style, and that will appeal to a certain kind of audience. So it really enhances the CPI's desire to reach a variety of people. I should add that Norman Rockwell, who will be very famous in the Second World War, is also a bit part illustrator in the First World War as well. But his are not the big famous posters.
I'm an American, of course, but my parents' ancestry, my father was Italian American, my mother was German American. And during that war, her name was Anna Marie Kaiser, her brothers Rudolf and Adolf Kaiser. And my mother told me that when she was a little girl going to school during that war, and my mom would murder flee, by the way, kids kicked her and spat on her, stuff like that, you dirty crowd, stuff like that. So,
Yes.
just a sad aside.
It is, and thank you for telling that. I mean, I think that a lot of those stories did not get told because the victims would be afraid to speak out about being harassed. And it's terribly sad that children are harassed, but you can certainly see why this message of hatred could end up backfiring on a country of such ethnic diversity. And we see sort of similar thing happen with Japanese Americans during World War II. So I think that for me, what's important to notice here is how German Americans were considered one of the most respected immigrant groups in America, and how war propaganda can turn that around so quickly to make them these kinds of victims and be accused of disloyalty and treasonous behavior.
Question back here and then one up front. Wait for a microphone, please. Hey, Karen.
Thank you. I'm intrigued by your point about the end of the war with the attempt to form the League of Nations and the treaty not being ratified by the Senate. I've never seen any posters about that topic. Did the CPI get involved in that debate at all?
No, I think that's one of the lessons that the World War II propaganda see as a mistake. So throughout World War II, you're going to see stuff about the United Nations over and over again and prepare Americans for joining some kind of international organization. President Wilson talked about the League of Nations, but he didn't really take the time or feel it was necessary to build a kind of support for that, or to get Americans to think about what that would mean for the United States to take on that kind of commitment. So, for example, one of the Senate objections to it was they feared that belonging to an international organization that was a collective security organization would undermine Congress's power to declare war. So partly it's a sovereignty issue for some Americans. For others, it's this attitude of, we just did not really enjoy that war in Europe. We don't want to get involved in anything like that again. So, and then there's a lot of distrust of the British as well. That's part of it. So there's a lot of complicating reasons. Oh, and I should mention one other thing. During World War I, the United States becomes the largest and most powerful financial country in the world. So its economy becomes number one. There are certainly Americans who think that the U.S. now has the power to do what it wants without allies. So there are also Americans who think they don't need to be part of a collective security organization.
Just curious, did they use propaganda in the Axis countries, the Germans, against the Allies, and how were the Allies, like, the Germans were the Huns and they were the demon Huns. How were the Allies, and particularly the Americans, portrayed in Germany?
Okay, yes, everybody uses propaganda during World War I. The Germans are, I think, quite effective in promoting support and sympathy for their own troops. But they do not use the kind of atrocity propaganda, which is a complaint that Adolf Hitler makes. In fact, the Germans avoid that kind of lying propaganda that the British and the Americans are using. So yes, they definitely do propaganda, but they don't, they tend to portray the Allies as threats to the German fatherland, German prestige. So they focus more on that, which is, I think, a more legitimate case than the kind of atrocity propaganda the British and the Americans use.
And this will be our last question over here.
Yes, you mentioned the drive to recruit up to 3 million people for the military. Now, given the disparate and various groups who are from other countries, was this, how many people were recruited for the military? And of these, were not a vast proportion, maybe second or third generation Americans versus first generation Americans?
Yes. So the draft age was, I think, 18 to 45. But the large majority of Americans who were drafted were single and working class. They were farmhands, factory workers. About 1 in 4 were illiterate, so they were not highly educated by and large, and about 100,000 did not speak English.
But how many total were actually enlisted or drafted out of 3 million target?
How many were drafted out of?
3 million people in arms.
I think it ends up being 4 million, but I'm not sure what the breakdown is between those who are drafted and those who enlist. Is that what you're asking? Okay. No, it's a mass army. It is a mass army. Now, a lot of the troops are never sent to Europe. The war ends before they are finished with their training and able to go. So I think it's about 2 million who end up going to France and Belgium.
Okay, so we could ask a lot of questions, but that was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, stay here a second.